It had been years since I last saw most of my extended family. Invitations to the annual reunion often ended up unopened, or at best glanced at and set aside. Over time, it became clear my presence was barely noticed, a shadow in the background of their lives. But this year, I decided to attend, not out of hope for recognition, but simply because I wanted to be there, to witness, to be part of what remained of my family. The house smelled of roasted meats and fresh bread, laughter echoing through the halls. I stepped inside quietly, careful not to disturb the gathering. Eyes flicked toward me and quickly turned away. The subtle dismissals, the quiet murmurs, reminded me of every year I had been ignored. Still, I held my head high. Uncle Robert, sitting in his favorite armchair, gave me a small nod, the only acknowledgement I received. Others whispered and exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of indifference and mild curiosity. I reminded myself that this wasn't about their approval. I had come to observe, to remember, and perhaps unknowingly, to prepare for what was coming. Children ran past, bumping into chairs and each other, their laughter unaware of the tension in the room. I found a quiet corner near the window, letting the sunlight wash over me as I watched familiar faces, aged and changed, interact. Some smiled easily, some frowned, and some were lost in thought. The room was alive, but I was still, quietly anchoring myself in the space they often overlooked. Dinner was served, and I took a plate, moving to the edge of the long table. Conversations flowed around me, stories being shared with no invitation for my voice. But I didn't mind. Patience had been my companion for years, and I knew that some moments, though small, carry the weight of years. This reunion, as ordinary as it seemed, was about to reveal truths they had ignored for far too long. After dinner, everyone gathered in the living room for coffee and desserts. The room buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the soft clinking of cups. I remained at the back, quietly observing. Faces I had known for decades seemed unfamiliar, aged by time and wrapped in their own little worlds. Occasionally, a glance flickered toward me, curious, cautious, or indifferent, but no one spoke directly. Then Uncle Robert cleared his throat. The room slowly fell silent. "I have something important to share," he began, holding a folded envelope in his hands. His tone commanded attention, yet there was a playful glint in his eye. "It's long overdue, and it concerns all of us." Whispers rippled through the room as relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Their casual conversations paused. I stayed seated, hands folded, heart beating steadily. The envelope seemed ordinary, but something in Uncle Robert's gaze suggested it was not. He carefully unfolded it and began to read aloud, upon reflection of family ties, loyalty, and contributions that often go unnoticed. "I have decided to make adjustments." His words slowly sank in. Every sentence was deliberate, emphasizing fairness, integrity, and recognition for those who had been overlooked. Heads turned toward me as he continued. "This includes someone who has often been invisible in family affairs, but whose presence deserves acknowledgement and respect." My pulse quickened slightly, though I remained composed. Gasps filled the room, and a few relatives leaned forward, disbelief evident in their expressions. The atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably. By the time he finished reading the first few lines, the energy in the room had changed. Whispers of surprise mingled with uncertainty. Eyes that had once ignored me were now tracking every movement, every gesture. I realized then that patience, quiet observation, and endurance over the years had brought me to this moment. The family dynamics I had accepted as permanent were beginning to transform before my eyes, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The room was thick with tension as Uncle Robert continued reading. "The family estate, which has been managed with little attention to fairness, will now be redistributed to reflect not only blood, relations, but also character and contribution." Gasps echoed around the room. Faces that had once shown indifference now displayed disbelief, curiosity, and a hint of anxiety. I remained seated, observing quietly. Years of being overlooked had taught me to watch rather than react. Cousins shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, whispering to one another, their previously confident expressions now tinged with uncertainty. Some parents exchanged glances, realizing that the privileges they had assumed for granted were no longer guaranteed. Uncle Robert's voice continued, steady and deliberate. This includes property, shares in family ventures, and responsibilities that have long been neglected. Each word landed with weight, and I could see the subtle changes in posture and demeanor around the room. Those who had underestimated me or dismissed my presence were now being forced to reconsider their assumptions. A few of the younger relatives looked toward me, curiosity and confusion in their eyes. I offered a small, calm smile, acknowledging their attention without arrogance. It was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about the quiet truth finally making itself known. The room had shifted from casual indifference to recognition. Not immediate or loud, but undeniable. By the time Uncle Robert paused to take a sip of water, the transformation in the atmosphere was palpable. Whispers had replaced laughter, thoughtful glances replaced dismissive ones, and the subtle undercurrent of respect began to emerge. I realized then that sometimes the most overlooked people hold the most influence, and patience is a form of power few recognize until it manifests in moments like this. After the reading, a subtle shift had settled over the room. Conversations, once light and careless, now carried a different tone, cautious, reflective. Relatives who had ignored me before now approached hesitantly, offering tentative smiles and soft words. I nodded politely, acknowledging them without urgency. Years of being overlooked had taught me patience, and I had no need to force recognition. Some whispered apologies reached my ears, though many avoided direct acknowledgement. The air of superiority and casual dismissal that had defined decades of family interactions was lifting, replaced by curiosity and uncertainty. I noticed my teenage cousin, who had once mocked me, fidgeting nervously in her seat. The lessons of fairness and humility were now unfolding visibly, whether she understood them or not. I stepped to the window for a quiet moment, letting the late afternoon sunlight wash over me. The warmth felt comforting, almost symbolic, as if the sun itself was highlighting the subtle changes in attitude around the room. I reflected on the years of invisibility, realizing that recognition doesn't always come loudly. It often arrives through patience, endurance, and the steady passage of time. Even the youngest children, oblivious to the tension, noticed the difference. The energy of the room had subtly altered, a quiet balance emerging where there had once been indifference. I felt no triumph, only a serene understanding that life sometimes restores fairness in its own unspoken way. The reunion, ordinary as it seemed at first, had quietly begun to reveal truths that would not be ignored again. As the evening progressed, small groups of relatives gathered, discussing Uncle Robert's announcement in hushed tones. Some argued quietly about their newly adjusted shares, while others reflected silently, realizing the importance of character and fairness over assumptions and entitlement. The room's energy had shifted. Indifference and condescension were replaced by uncertainty and contemplation. I sat quietly, observing it all. Years of being overlooked had taught me resilience and empathy, and now I saw the subtle effects of patience and presence. The recognition I had quietly earned was not flashy or dramatic. It was woven into the reactions, the body language, the slight pauses and thoughtful glances. Those who had dismissed me were now forced to reconsider not only the family estate but also the person they had ignored. A few relatives approached me, cautiously, offering tentative smiles and soft words. I nodded, giving them space to rebuild connections on their own. This was never about revenge. It was about fairness, presence, and letting truth reveal itself in its own time. As I looked around the room, I realized that sometimes the quietest members of a family hold the deepest influence, shaping events without ever demanding attention. By the time the reunion began to wind down, the dynamics had shifted permanently. The lessons of patience, observation, and integrity were now etched subtly into the room. I left with a calm sense of fulfillment, knowing that sometimes being seen doesn't require shouting. It only requires waiting for the right moment. The next morning, the house was quiet. Most relatives had left, carrying with them a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and contemplation. I remained for a moment, sitting near the window with a cup of tea, reflecting on the events of the previous day. The reunion had been ordinary on the surface, but beneath it, subtle shifts in perception had taken place. Seeds planted that would continue to grow long after I had gone. Messages and calls soon followed. Some relatives reached out, cautiously testing the waters, acknowledging my presence in ways they hadn't before. Others remained distant, reluctant to accept the changes. I replied with measured words, encouraging understanding and dialogue rather than confrontation. Patience had always been my ally, and now it was proving its quiet strength. I thought about the children I had watched during the reunion, how they had noticed things their parents overlooked. Perhaps the greatest change would be seen in them, learning that respect and attention are not automatically granted, but earned through actions and character. I smiled faintly, realizing that the impact of yesterday's revelations would ripple for years, far beyond a single gathering. By the evening, I felt a calm sense of closure. The reunion had been more than a meeting. It had been a moment of reckoning, a subtle restructuring of family dynamics. Those who had dismissed me would carry new awareness with them, whether they fully understood it yet or not. And I, having remained true to myself, walked away with quiet satisfaction, knowing the narrative had shifted in ways they could not ignore. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in family interactions. Phone calls that had once gone unanswered were returned with politeness. Messages that had been ignored now received thoughtful responses. Even distant cousins, previously indifferent, began to acknowledge my presence in small but meaningful ways. The impact of Uncle Robert's reading extended far beyond the reunion itself, reaching into the everyday rhythms of family life. At home, I reflected on the experience. Patience, humility, and endurance had guided me through years of being overlooked. The recognition that came so quietly was more powerful than any overt display of attention or approval. I realized that influence does not always announce itself. It often works in silence, shaping perceptions and attitudes without force or demand. I received one final message from a relative I had long felt estranged from. "Thank you for being there," it read simply. No explanation, no fanfare, just acknowledgement. That single note carried more weight than years of empty gestures. I smiled, understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of recognition are the most profound, and that the quietest members of a family can hold the deepest significance. When the moment is right, the reunion, once seemingly insignificant, had become a turning point, not through confrontation or drama, but through patience, presence, and the natural unfolding of truth. And as the days passed, I felt a quiet certainty that the family I had once thought indifferent was now slowly learning to see me, not just as a relative, but as someone whose presence mattered. The following reunion the next year felt different. The house was alive with familiar laughter, but the energy had shifted. Those who had once dismissed me now approached with genuine smiles, offering conversations that felt sincere rather than obligatory. I noticed subtle glances exchanged among family members, a silent acknowledgement that the balance had changed. I walked through the rooms with calm confidence, observing small moments that would have gone unnoticed before. A cousin pausing to ask about my life, a niece sharing a story she wanted me to hear, a sibling offering a quiet nod of appreciation. It was not just about the estate or the announcement. It was about the human connections finally realigned. Sitting by the window in the late afternoon, sunlight streaming in, I reflected on the journey. Years of being overlooked had taught me patience, endurance, and the quiet power of presence. The reunion had revealed truths not through confrontation, but through the natural consequences of integrity and recognition. As I left that day, I felt a profound sense of closure. The family that once ignored me now saw me, not as a shadow, but as a valued member. The subtle transformations in relationships, the quiet shifts in respect and attention, reminded me that time and patience often speak louder than immediate acknowledgement. I realized that sometimes, the ones who seem invisible hold the deepest impact when the right moment arrives, and true recognition can never be taken away once it has been earned. The reunion was no longer just a tradition. It had become a testament to patience, resilience, and the quiet triumph of dignity.